Hey, and welcome back to the Fully Booked Photographer podcast. And yes, if you're watching us on YouTube, you can see that it's just two of us this week too, except it's not myself and Janine, it's myself and Brad this week. And the reason why we're doing these conversations and chats with each of the individual mentor team is it just allows you to see a bit more of the heart and soul of each of the individual mentors. Because we see it all the time. We see it talked about in the industry. Often people see the fully booked photographer and might just associate it with me, but I'm only one of four musketeers. And often we hear people saying, like, who does he think he is teaching photographers how to run photography businesses when he's never run a studio himself? And if you didn't know what goes on in the fully booked photographer, then that might be something you might say. But for me, it's a bit like a photographer who's an expert in lighting and posing and the art and science photography, teaching business. So my own personal background is I've run multi seven-figure businesses, still do today. And it's not about the turnover being close to eight figures. It's about the bottom line, the profit first bottom line. And we have very successful businesses. But within the mentor team, we have very successful people running photography businesses and other businesses. And Brad, who's joining me today, and one of our mentor team, comes from a third generation photography studio that we'll talk about in a moment. But the important thing about that too is Brad is also very successful in building up an investment portfolio business that has come about because of their family's success in the photography business. So Brad, let's deep dive, because it was your granddad and your dad who started the photography business, right?
Yeah, that is correct. So going back many, many years ago, about 45 years, my grandfather was the press photographer for the Barnsley Chronicle. So he would do odd jobs for the Chronicle. And at the same time was venturing into photographing weddings and wanted some help photographing weddings and would pester my dad to come and help him. But my dad hated the idea of it, hated the thought of going to be a photographer, didn't want to take pictures, had no interest whatsoever. So went and got a job at Ransom and Rapier's. He was a clerk just in their admin division, and absolutely hated it, despised the job. His first day there, I suppose my dad's first ever mentor was a gentleman called Wilf, who sat next to him, who was probably in his 40s, 50s when my dad just started that job at 19. And the first conversation he had with my dad was he walked over and said, "There's nothing here for you, kid. You best leave now." After 2 days, my dad quickly realized he was correct. There was nothing there for him, and he needed to leave. And he was too old to go get an apprenticeship anywhere else. So he very reluctantly agreed to go out with my grandfather and pick up a camera. So my dad's interest in photography started purely as a way to improve his life and for him to earn more money. That he wasn't a creative individual before that. He didn't become a photographer because he loved photography. He picked up a camera to earn money, and then developed that love for photography.
So he was there was an entrepreneurial fire within him, right? And the opportunity to work with your granddad and set up a business from it. Was the business there before your dad came into it, or did they get together to actually create a studio? How did that come about?
Yeah, so my granddad was doing odd jobs at the time. So technically, you could say the business existed in that he was not in its current name, but my granddad was doing work for people. But then when my dad joined, that's when they created Stand Plus Stand 2. So that's where the name comes from. Back in the day, used to have a bank manager, like a proper bank manager, used to go and see and have meetings with. Now banks are pretty faceless, but it was their bank manager who gave them the name, because both my grandfather and father were both called Stan, and my granddad was always known as Big Stan, so it was always Stan Plus Stan 2. My dad being Stan 2, and then my dad and my granddad liked that name, so they decided to roll with it. And then incorporated the business in 1978. So it's about 45 years old at present.
Wow, that's amazing, Brad. When you think about how long businesses actually last, right? That, I think it's 50% of businesses are gone in the first 5 years. So
Yeah.
to last that and to transition through that, obviously there's been a lot of reinvention around along the way. But let's talk about that a little later. Let's just talk to get a little bit more of the history, because it's not just your dad and yourself that's in the business, right? Your mum's also been a central part of the business for years too. So when did your mum come into the business?
It's an interesting question, because my parents used to always photograph weddings on Saturdays. So even before, when my mum was working at Radio Rentals, she'd still go and help my dad to photograph weddings on Saturdays. So my dad would always have one wedding on a Saturday, if not two. He shot thousands of weddings. That was like the main bread and butter of the business when him and my grandfather set it up. And they only really stopped doing weddings in about 2010, or probably a little bit later, probably about 2014, which is when I got into the business. Because by that point, my dad didn't really want to do weddings anymore. He could earn more money in the studio on a Saturday than he could out on a wedding, and it was much less stress, and his workload was much more reduced. So he pivoted from photographing weddings to just doing the in-studio work.
So so they set up the business, as you said, in 1978, right?
Yes.
But the business was running technically before that with your granddad. But did they have the studio? Did they do portraits then, or did they set up the business but they were primarily doing weddings? Or when did the studio come as part of the business where you're currently located? Because it's an amazing studio. If anyone hasn't seen Brad's studio, you need to see that. But when was the timing around that, Brad?
So it was a few years after they set the business up. So they're doing mostly weddings. The business was set up in my dad's old bedroom on Brinkman Street in Barnsley, two down terraced house. That was their office for many years, until they actually went and got a studio. So they rented a studio just down, essentially it's like Peel Street in Barnsley Town Centre. So they've been in Barnsley Town Centre for about 40 years with a studio location of some descript. And the story of how my dad got that studio was quite fraught, because at the time nobody would rent to him. So he couldn't actually get a physical premises because nobody would trust him or want to touch him with a barge pole. But he had a really good friend. So something that my dad and granddad were really great with was connecting with people. It was a fantastic skill that my grandfather had. He was brilliant at speaking, doing public speaking, and he could just connect really well. So he connected to a guy called Dennis, who ran multiple hair studios across Barnsley. And then would later go on to launch an international training academy for hairdressers. He got the lease for the business. So here, Stanley, this is what we're going to do. I'll get the lease. I'll take it right up to a month before, or a couple of days before I'm going to sign it. I'm going to pull out. I'm going to say, don't worry about it. I've got Stan Bulmer over here, who's just the right man for the job, and he's going to sign in. He's going to take the premises for you. That's exactly what happened. He got the premises. They agreed to lease it out to him. I took it all the way down to 2 days before, then pulled out and got my dad down there. So that's how my dad got his first studio.
Wow.
Being sneaky.
That's amazing. But that's the entrepreneur, right? We'll make it happen, no matter how we have to make it happen, right?
Yeah, and that's my dad and granddad through and through. That you just got to get shit done, and they did. They just had to find a way, and that was the way that they could get it done.
Because a lot of people would have just given up, right? They would have said, I can't do it, But so that's the entrepreneur coming out there again. So then the current studio, right, was that because you guys own your studio, right?
Yes.
So when did that come about? That wasn't the studio he leased first, was it, that you bought?
No, that wasn't. So after that studio he leased, he then bought a premises on Old Mill Lane, which we still own and it's currently let out. So after he bought that premises, which is a little bit under 1,000 square foot, so it worked for a long time, but then my dad wanted more space. So it was around, we've had the studio now 20 years. So it's about early 2000s, 2002, 2003. My dad went to train to be a venture photographer. So venture at the time in the UK was massive. There were recruiting photographers all across. So he was going to be Venture Barnsley, and got all the way through the Venture Training Academy. So he's still got, my dad keeps everything. So he's still got all the certificates to say he's an approved and qualified venture photographer, all the big booklets of all the marketing stuff that they ever did. And the last thing was Venture would send out a regional manager who would essentially be the guy that would be in charge of managing the studio to make sure it hit KPIs. And him and my mum didn't get on. There was quite a lot of, apparently, I've met the man, this is way before my time, but it was particularly arrogant. And he brushed my mother up wrong. So my mother convinced my dad to pull out of doing Venture Barnsley. But the studio that my dad bought, Venture wanted him to buy. So as part of the deal, they wanted him to buy the studio and then refit it out. So he didn't sign the contract to be a venture studio, went out to do it himself, but still bought the same building.
Interesting. Isn't that an amazing story in terms of just, again, the entrepreneurial spirit, but the importance of people, right? Because I see this all the time, Brad. Like, let's say I'm out with Susan, right? And we go in and we're, I don't know, let's just say we're looking at for a new car, right? And the two of us walk in. And the amount of salespeople who might ignore Susan in that scenario.
Yeah.
It's the wrong thing to do. Everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and understood, which we need to do with our clients as photographers, but it's also critical in any business relationship, not even any business relationship, any personal relationship. Everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and understood. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because if that person was different and did connect with your mum, things could have been totally different, right?
Oh, 100%. We could have been Venture Barnsley and been bankrupt like the rest of them. Most of them.
There's still a lot.
There's still a good few going, but from its peak of 114 studios down to probably about 18, it did take a tumble. But my dad, it's funny because doing venture, my dad had to get a bank loan to buy this building. So the fact he had to go out and get this bank loan was another one of the big reasons why he didn't end up doing it, because to get the loan, he had to do a business plan. And that really, from that point, my dad's, not that he's shot by the hip, but he's always based decisions based on feeling and based on exposure and based on just his experience. When he had to write that business plan out, he had to actually create a document, a proper plan. And when he had the plan and he looked at the plan he created, and he looked at the plan Venture had proposed to him, he would make more money on half the turnover doing it himself than he would if he was a Venture franchisee. So then that knowledge then was like, that coupled with my mum not getting on with their regional manager was just the easiest decision he ever made.
Interesting. So, but without that, he may never have made the jump into the current studio, right?
Yeah, no, exactly.
It's crazy. It's crazy how all these things tie together and result in that end outcome. So your amazing wife Ruth is in the business too, right? When I say is now your wife, because you've been together for years and years and years, but it's only recently you got married. But so how did Ruth come into the business?
Yeah, so first podcast, Ronan. First podcast. I'm a married man.
There we go.
For all the countless other podcasts when I've been referring to Ruth as my soon-to-be wife, or nearly wife, or partner, but now wife, which is much easier to say. But yeah, so Ruth got into the business when I was in the business. If she listens to this, she'll kill me because I'll probably get some of these dates wrong. It was probably around 2014, 13. She was at university in Leeds, studying new digital media. And we, at the studio, we had space for somebody to come in and help us out with some admin work. So we just lost our digital editor. So we had an in-house digital editor for, Gav probably worked with us about 16 years. He left to go start a family in Norwich, which is the other end of the country. So we needed some help just to tie us over on that editing side. My dad has never edited a photograph in his entire life, not once. When Photoshop came out, he didn't view that as something that he should be doing. He always just he saw his value in the camera and taking photographs, and that was post-production. That was editing was just the same as ordering to him. That it had nothing to do with him as an artist or as a businessman. So he knows nothing about Photoshop. Probably one of the only photographers I know that does. So when Gav left, we had a bit of a hole. That Ruth then came in part-time to help us fill, doing a bit of editing work and then outsourcing the editing and handling ordering. And that turned into phone calls and turned into doing sales and then turned into getting in the studio with my dad. When you run a small business, you tend to be that everybody has to kind of be good at everything or at least know everything to a little degree.
So which came first, your relationship with Ruth or the job?
My relationship with Ruth.
Okay.
Yeah, we've been together since I was 17.
Right. Okay. That's something we have in common. That's something we've got in common too.
Yeah,
Susan and I, 17. Yeah. So we were about to turn 18. We met in the 9th of January of the year that I turned 18 in March. Yeah. But and she turned 18 that year, but we were technically 17.
Ruth's a cougar. She's 18. Well, she was 18 when we met. I was 17.
Right. There we go. Next time I see her now, I'll go, rah. All right. So there's other people working in the business too, right? You've hair and makeup artists as well, right?
Yes, Holly,
yes. So, and when did Holly join the business?
About 5 years ago, 2017. Right. So Holly was freelance for us for a long time. So for a long time when we were doing boudoir, we used to hire freelance makeup artists, and we just pay them a day rate or per session to come in and do the hair and makeup. And we had one makeup artist who was fantastic with clients and fantastic at applying makeup, but was the flakiest person you'd ever imagine. So because she constantly let us down, it meant that we had to have multiple makeup artists. So at one point we were divvying our boudoir makeup job between 4 different makeup artists. Holly was the one that we liked the best out of that because she was the best at makeup. She was the best with clients and she was incredibly reliable. And it was just, what are we doing? Why don't we just employ her full time? She can do the makeup and then she can take Ruth's job of handling editing and post-production. And then that frees Ruth up to being in the studio because Ruth has always wanted to photograph. And then we just didn't have the time to be able to do it. We were back then the studio was doing like 36. We were booking in 36 clients a week to shoot 24. We were very high volume, and my dad was photographing all that work. And Ruth just didn't have the time to get in the studio because she had to do all that post-production for it because we had to get the work out. So by Holly coming in, it enabled Ruth to get in the studio.
Great stuff. Right. I want to go backwards in time now, right? So
all right, shoot.
You talked about your dad, Stan, and your granddad, and it was primarily weddings up to 2020, right? And your mum was in the business helping prior to that with your dad and the weddings on a Saturday. And then when they set up the studio, was that when they started to do the first studio? Was that when they started to do portraiture? And was that sort of we'll do families and everything, or what was the focus at that stage?
Yes. So when they got their first studio, they started to do portraiture. And at the time, it was mostly families that you'd come in and photograph. My dad and I have the photographs. So I don't know why, but they did themes. They did a Western theme, and they got the hay bales. My dad still has the hay bales because obviously he does. And obviously I was photographed on that set dressed as a cowboy as about 4 years old. So my dad really photographed anything that was popular or anything that he could earn income on. It was the typical kind of I'll do that. I'll photograph that if it means I can have a client in front of my camera and they can spend some money.
So this idea for the themes, what year was that? Like, that would have been when?
1998,
So
99.
was that even a thing then? Was there, or was it something he did? Like he did he just pick that up himself and decide to run with it, or did he see it somewhere else, or do you know?
I doubt he'd have created it. He'd have more than likely stolen it from somebody else.
Okay.
And me and my dad have that in common, is that if we see something we like, we'll steal it and get it up and going as quick as possible.
So what you're saying is you're not really British, you're Japanese, right? So we see like the Japanese car makers used to say, right, let's take that car and let's make it better, right?
Yeah.
And make it better than the other makers, and that was their philosophy. So we won't reinvent it; we'll just take it and make it better.
Yeah.
So that's part of the philosophy.
No, 100%. Like that, we've photographed loads of different genres over the time, and it's been driven a lot by my dad's. My dad sees somebody doing something successful, and he thinks, "Oh, we can do that. We can add that in as part of our business." So that's how we started to do first birthday cake smashes, because he saw a photographer in America doing it, and he thought we can do that. And we did very, very well with first birthday cake smashes for a long time. The only reason we don't do them now is just because we predominantly photograph boudoir, and we found boudoir. Go on, sorry, Ronan.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the journey into boudoir, right, and how that came about, and why. When we do that, right, and we talk about that, let's just talk about it too in the context of why it was thought that boudoir would be better than, say, cake smashes. Like, what was the driver for that change, other than another opportunity, rather than it just being, here's someone else I've seen make money from this, and we should do this too?
It would be my mum. So up till that point, my mum was never in the studio, unless my dad had large family groups that he might need help liaising with kids and just talking to people while I was setting individual shots up. Boudoir was the one that it was at a Click conference many years ago, and I can't remember the gentleman's. I think it was Shane who did a presentation on it. I can't remember his surname, about boudoir photography. And both my parents, so it was my mum and my dad, really resonated with the idea and then wanted to trial it. So we've been photographing boudoir for probably about 12 years now, about 2011, maybe even before then. And then it just evolved over time into what it is now. And my parents they fell in love with photographing boudoir. But I mean, you don't know what you don't know. So they didn't know the concept of a why then. They didn't know how to write things down or visualize that. But they were drawn to photographing boudoir and always wanted to photograph boudoir, even though there were more challenges involved in it. You had to have a makeup artist. You had to have a reliable makeup artist. They built an entire studio for it downstairs. So up until that point, we just had the one photography room. And then after they started photographing boudoir, we're shooting it in the top studio and, on blow-up beds that my dad would blow up. And then the amount of beds that go through, because customers just keep putting the high heels through. Eventually, they built the studio downstairs to accommodate it. So it was an investment. It was much harder work than just to photograph babies, but they did it because they loved it. They loved the connection they had with the clients. They loved how the clients felt after having the experience. And they just wanted to do more of it. They got hooked on that.
And I know you've talked about that it wasn't a conscious strategic decision for their why, right? But most whys are not done that way, right? Because even my why came from being in the industry and recognizing, based on my own personal experiences and the experience of my family as to how this why came about, right? But and that's the way it should be, because your why comes from a part of the brain that can't even verbalize, so and we write our stories and it comes from that. So your mum and dad's road to discovering their why came from their experience, which is absolutely, I know you as a strategist might find this difficult, but that's the way it should be. It's not a grand strategy that you dream up and then it becomes that. It comes from what you do. So they were obviously drawn to boudoir when they saw it, and your mother connected with it, very closely, as you said initially. And then your dad with his entrepreneurial skills probably saw, well, the barrier to entry to this is much more than any other type of photography. So the two of them together were probably thinking about it slightly differently, but they both then, when they started to do it, it delivered for both their needs. And your dad probably, when he saw the effect it had on the clients, even reinforced that the decision was right, even though the driver for the decision were probably slightly different in the beginning. That's fascinating, Brad. That's a fascinating story. So the business then started to specialize in boudoir, and started to make a difference to people through boudoir. And today, then, is most of the business boudoir? Is that the speciality, or do you have do you do family and other things as well, or what does the rest of the core business look like?
It's probably about 90% boudoir. We still photograph anything, so dogs, babies, cake smashers, but we're not actively marketing for them. And that's just past clients who want to have that experience. So we've not said no to past clients doing that, but in terms of our entire marketing strategy is focused around boudoir.
So, what, from a person who's very much a business person, right, which you are, what has that, like, we talk about the richest and the niches, and we talk about it not being necessarily about the money, that's a result, but that it helps form closer relationships. And to form closer relationships, we have to over deliver for people, right? So have you seen by going down to that boudoir niche that the whole team can focus on that much more than if you were a GP, like if you were doing everything from themes and weddings and family and boudoir and cake smashes and everything? Has that that focus allowed you and your team to deliver an experience for your clients that goes beyond their expectations?
So yes. So I'd say the focus part, we were highly focused. We're probably more focused than we were the GP, because we were busier. And that busyness made us be laser focused because we had to be. Whereas now we're still focused on the clients, but because we have less clients and we're just doing boudoir, it means we have more time. And that time is the biggest thing that impacts it, because the focus has always been there. It's just the attention we can spend now, because now we can spend more time. We can take things slower. We're not restricted to doing a 45-minute experience, or Holly's not restricted to 45 minutes in makeup. They have the time to go over on that, and deliver an experience truly tailored to that client. It's much more personal.
So Brad, that's really interesting, and I'd like to deep dive into this a little bit, right? So with the focus, right? Because obviously, if I'm photographing and I'm focusing the camera on a subject, right, that in the same way, when you were really, really busy, you were focused, but was a focus on more on the operational efficiency of doing a volume of, versus a focus on truly forming really important friendships with the clients, which allows you to deliver even a greater value to them in the transformation that they go through the boudoir.
So both, because that interaction has always been critically important to my parents, especially because they're the front of the studio. They're the people photographing. They're the people doing the sales. They're the people the clients interact with. So that's always been been what's important to them, because we've got clients that have come back to us for 30 years longer. My dad's photographing grandchildren from grandparents he photographed for the wedding, and then it's just all comes full circle. But it's the ability to have time is massive. To be able to create a much better. It's now not just 50% of the clients get that extra time. It's everybody gets that extra time.
And it's also, I think, Brad, there's a really important message in what you've said in the story, is that the reason why you've been in business for so long, right? And you're on the third generation. And I think you said collectively, your dad and your mum have 100 years plus experience in the industry, right?
Yeah.
This, you can't get comfortable, I think is what you've said, is that you have to be willing to pivot and change to survive, not just survive, but thrive. So we talk a lot about creating a sustainable, profitable business, but one of the key things to that is you can't get comfortable, right?
Yeah, you can't be comfortable. You have to embrace change, because change comes, and the business has had tremendous change in the years it's been operating, especially through the years my parents have operated it, and they've had to make decisions to change the business to make it work.
So, and that's a key message. And Brad, I can't believe our time is up in this podcast, but we have another podcast with Brad, just Brad and I, coming next week too. And I think that idea of change, or we need to accept change, will come out in our next conversation, when we're going to talk a bit more about, your journey through the business, Brad, but how that became a speciality in marketing, and in particular using online marketing to fill your studio and become fully booked every single week. So thank you, Brad, for sharing your story. Please thank, your dad, your mum, and Ruth, and Holly too, for sharing their story for them. And thank you for everything you do as a fully booked mentor. So on that note, we'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.
Thank you, Ronan. Thank you, everybody.